Be a calm Saturday afternoon at the zoo, a place where families wandered through exhibits, admiring animals from behind the safety of barriers. However, for Robert and Sarah Dawson, the tension that had been simmering between them boiled over in the worst possible way. They had been bickering throughout the day, exchanging terse words over trivial matters, but as they neared the polar bear exhibit, their argument reached a new, dangerous height. Robert's face twisted with frustration. His eyes burned with a rage that had been festering for weeks, months perhaps. Sarah, on the other hand, appeared exhausted, worn down from the constant conflict. She turned to walk away, but in an instant the unexpected happened. In a moment of sheer madness or cruelty, no one could say which, Robert's hand shot out. His fingers clenched around her shoulder, and with shocking force he shoved her forward. Sarah, unprepared and unable to react, lost her balance. A horrified gasp escaped her as her body pitched over the barrier that separated visitors from the polar bear habitat. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to freeze. Then, she plummeted downward, her arms flailing in vain as she tumbled into the moat below. A sickening thud echoed as she hit the water, sending a spray of droplets into the air. Above her, a chorus of screams erupted from the crowd. Faces that had moments ago been indifferent now contorted in shock and disbelief. Parents clutched their children tightly as they turned away, trying to shield them from the horrific scene unfolding before them. Others stood rooted in place, their eyes wide with terror as they pointed toward the polar bear enclosure. The resident polar bear, a massive male, was resting near the water's edge within the enclosure. He lounged in the midday sun, his powerful body stretched out lazily. But the sudden commotion disturbed the tranquility. Its ears perked up, his black eyes narrowing as he lifted his head to assess the source of the noise. At first, the bear was merely curious. His massive paws, nearly the size of dinner plates, thudded softly against the ground as he lumbered closer to the water's edge. His thick, snow-white fur rippled as he moved, and his breath came out in slow, heavy puffs. The bear's focus zeroed in on Sarah, who lay motionless in the shallow water of the moat. She had landed awkwardly, her legs and back partially submerged. The initial shock had paralyzed her with fear, her mind reeling from the sudden fall. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. The cold water seeped into her clothes, but the chill barely registered amid her overwhelming panic. She could hear the crowd's shouts, distant and muffled, as though they were coming from another world. Above her, the hulking form of bear loomed closer, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, curious about the intruder in his domain. The polar bear stopped at the edge of the moat, peering down at Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. His enormous head dipped lower as he stretched his neck out, his eyes locked on her. Sarah, in a primal survival instinct, remained perfectly still. She knew, deep down, that any sudden movement could trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Her breaths became shallow, each one a desperate attempt to calm the rising tide of terror threatening to engulf her. Meanwhile, chaos had erupted above. Zoo staff, alerted by the frantic cries of the onlookers, rushed to initiate emergency protocols. Two keepers sprinted toward the enclosure, radios crackling with commands as they coordinated a rescue plan. One of them, a seasoned handler who had worked with polar bears for years, quickly retrieved a bucket of fish from a nearby station. They hoped to distract the bear long enough to give the rescue team a chance to extract Sarah. But time was running out, and the bear's curiosity deepened. He lowered himself closer to the water, his nose hovering just inches from Sarah's body. His warm breath, tinged with the scent of fish and meat, washed over her as he sniffed at her. The air between them was thick with tension, every second stretching into eternity. Sarah's muscles ached from the effort of remaining still, her mind screaming for her to flee. But she fought the instinct, knowing it would be a death sentence. The bear's enormous paw swiped at the water, sending ripples across the surface. His claws, sharp and deadly, gleamed in the sunlight as he dipped them into the moat. For a moment it seemed as though he might step into the water, his immense weight shifting forward. Sarah's breath hitched as she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for what she thought would be the end. Suddenly, from the far side of the enclosure, the keepers made their move. One of them tossed a handful of fish toward him, the pungent scent immediately catching the bear's attention. His head snapped in the direction of the food, and his nostrils flared again. For a moment he hesitated, torn between investigating the human before him or indulging in the easy meal being offered. The fish won. With a low grunt, the bear turned away from Sarah, his massive body pivoting as he lumbered toward the pile of fish. His focus shifted, his hunger overriding his curiosity about the strange woman in the water. The keepers seized the opportunity, continuing to throw food to distract him as the rescue team descended into the moat. 2 staff members, equipped with harnesses and ropes, reached Sarah. They moved quickly but carefully, knowing that any noise or sudden movement could draw the bear's attention back to them. One of them crouched beside her, gently grabbing her arm and signaling for her to stay calm. Sarah, though trembling, managed to nod slightly. She allowed herself to be lifted, her limbs heavy from shock and exhaustion. As the team worked to pull Sarah out of the moat, the keepers maintained their distraction with the bear, who remained focused on the food. Slowly but surely, they hoisted Sarah to safety, her drenched body collapsing onto the ground once she was clear of the enclosure. Her chest heaved with sobs as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Above, Robert Dawson was being subdued by security. His face, once contorted with anger, now bore an expression of shock and disbelief. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and officers led him away from the scene as onlookers jeered and shouted at him. The crowd's fury was palpable, their shock quickly transforming into disgust at the horrific act they had just witnessed. In the aftermath, media outlets swarmed the zoo, the incident making headlines across the nation. Robert was charged with attempted murder, his actions sparking a heated debate about domestic violence and public safety. Sarah, though physically unharmed, would carry the scars of that day for the rest of her life, both from the betrayal of the man she had once trusted and the haunting memory of the bear's cold, calculating gaze. In July 2016, the Carter family of Florida traveled to Canada for what they thought would be a happy, week-long trip. They had long wished to reach the remote banks of British Columbia's Fraser River and do some high-quality fishing. Their love for fishing was instilled by Grandpa Donald, an experienced fisherman with countless stories of the one who got away. Ron Carter, Donald's son, was now a father himself, and he too passed this passion on to his 12-year-old son, Max. Together with Kelly, Ron's adventurous and nature-loving wife, they made plans for a summer trip that promised bonding and bountiful catches. Anglers from all over the world were drawn to the Fraser River because of its pristine, rugged beauty and renowned salmon runs. Winding through some of the most stunning scenery in British Columbia, the river provided a calm refuge from the bustle of the city. The thought of throwing their lines into the crystal-clear, thundering waves while taking in the sounds of nature and towering trees enthralled the Carters. It was the morning of their 4th day when it happened. That day, the Carters had risen early, sometime before dawn broke with a gentle glow, painting the sky pink and orange. They wanted to make the most of the morning and spend as much time as possible surrounded by the rich nature surrounding them. The sun was barely beginning to peek over the horizon, but Grandpa Donald was already at the riverbank, checking his gear and getting ready for another long day of fishing. Donald was nothing but devoted to his craft. Ron was there too, setting up his fishing gear. He felt at ease out there, and he was amused as he watched his son, Max, running excitedly between them. Ron saw that Max's face was lit with anticipation. Kelly, Ron's wife, was back at the campsite where she was in charge of breakfast. She carefully lit the portable stove, her movements efficient and confident. Kelly then called for Max to gather wood for a small fire. Max felt proud to be put in charge of such an important task. Donald and Ron, having set their lines, returned to the camp, the air thick with the mouth-watering aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs. But they weren't the only ones savoring the aroma of their breakfast. Unbeknownst to them, the scent had caught the attention of a grizzly bear. Driven by hunger and territorial instincts, the bear decided to investigate. It prowled closer, completely concealed by the dense underbrush. The Carters were too caught up in the movements of their morning routine. As such, they remained unaware of the impending danger. They gathered around their makeshift table and started eating. Young Max was famished. He shoved food into his mouth as the adults passed plates and shared stories. They had nothing to worry about, or so they thought. In reality, the grizzly was creeping closer, its dark eyes focused on the camp. A few minutes later, Max was ready to go, but the grown-ups weren't finished yet. The boy couldn't sit still, so he leapt off his folding chair and wandered a few steps away to fetch more firewood. But as he gathered the wood, Max sensed something was amiss. He raised his head and froze. He could only let out a startled gasp as he and the huge grizzly bear made eye contact. That's when Donald, Ron, and Kelly realized they weren't as alone and safe as they had hoped. Ron shouted at Max to get back quickly. His voice was tinged with fear as he did so, but he didn't want to frighten Max. But Max couldn't move. Ron cursed under his breath and sprang to his feet. In a flash, he stepped in front of his son, arms spread wide as to appear larger. Kelly shivered as she grabbed a pot and banged it loudly, hoping the noise would scare the predator away. Her face was pale, her heart gripped by terror. Her baby Max was in danger. Donald searched for something to fend off the predator, but there was nothing that could help them. The bear roared and attacked, unfazed by their frenzied actions. As the family attempted to defend themselves, chaos broke out. It was like attempting to halt a tidal wave with a twig, but Ron grabbed a branch and swung it fiercely at the bear. With a single forceful attack, the bear knocked Ron off balance and sent him smashing onto the ground. Kelly flung the pot at the bear, but it only bounced off its powerful body. The bear turned its attention to Donald. The old man, though frail, stood his ground, trying to protect his family. The bear's massive jaws closed around Donald's arm and he cried out in pain. Kelly screamed, her maternal instincts overriding her fear as she rushed to her father-in-law's aid. The bear, now fully in a frenzy, slashed at her with its claws and she fell, her scream abruptly silenced. Ron struggled to get to his feet. He was dazed, his ears were ringing and his temple was bloodied. He told Max to run, to get to the river. Max spun around and bolted toward the water, his pulse thumping fiercely. Behind him, he could hear the bear howling and his father yelling, but he was too terrified to look back. But then he reached the riverbank, and he couldn't stand not knowing anymore. He slowly turned back. Max was met with a gruesome sight. The bear stood over his parents' limp bodies. Grandpa Donald was a few feet away from them, as still and bloodied as they were. Max knew this was it. He realized he was next, as the bear turned to face him, its muzzle covered with blood. In a final act of desperation, Max grabbed a fishing pole, holding it out in front of him as a pathetic barrier. The bear charged, and Max felt a sharp pain as it knocked him to the ground. His vision blurred, the world fading to darkness as the bear's jaws closed around him. And then, it was over. The Carter family's screams had echoed through the forest, but had fallen on deaf ears, those of trees, water, and rocks. In the isolation of their chosen fishing spot, no help was nearby. Their bear spray, packed safely inside a backpack, was unreachable. The relentless assault left no survivors, and the once peaceful campsite became a dark reminder of the wild's untamed nature. Their bodies were discovered hours later by another group of fishermen. If only they had reached the river sooner. Authorities were called, and the bodies were retrieved from the riverbank. All that was left was an eerie silence. The backcountry expedition was meant to be a testament to the group's experience and camaraderie. They had planned every detail meticulously, from the ski routes to the weather patterns. 5 seasoned skiers set out into the rugged wilderness of British Columbia, seeking untouched powder and the serene isolation that only the backcountry could offer. For years they had done this, gliding down steep, unmarked trails, weaving through thick forests, and embracing the biting cold as they carved their paths down snow-covered mountains. But this time, fate had other plans. As the group descended from a ridgeline, their leader, a seasoned skier named Liam, slowed down, guiding the others through a section of trees. The terrain here was steep, with deep snowbanks accumulated from recent storms. The skiers expertly zigzagged down the slope, but their movement disturbed the quiet harmony of the wilderness. Unbeknownst to them, beneath the thick blanket of snow lay a hidden threat, one they would soon regret awakening. Grizzly bears, normally dormant during this time of year, can occasionally stir from hibernation if their dens are disrupted, or if temperatures fluctuate enough to disturb their deep slumber. The group skied past an area where a massive grizzly had made its den, tucked away beneath layers of snow and debris. With every swoosh of their skis, the vibrations penetrated the earth, reverberating through the snowpack. It happened suddenly. The snow shifted and a massive shape stirred from the depths. The bear, groggy and disoriented from its long hibernation, felt the intrusion. Its instincts, still sharp despite months of dormancy, took over. The scent of humans filled its nose, triggering a surge of confusion and hunger. Emerging from the den, the grizzly, a colossal beast with matted fur and claws the size of daggers, was startled by the presence of the skiers. The bear's eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto the nearest skier, Derek, who had unknowingly skied too close. In a matter of seconds, the once peaceful mountainside erupted into chaos. The bear charged, its powerful limbs breaking through the deep snow with terrifying ease. The skiers, momentarily stunned by the sight, reacted too slowly. Derek turned to see the grizzly barreling towards him, its massive form cutting through the snow like a freight train. Panic set in, but there was no time to flee. Liam shouted to the others, motioning for them to spread out. But Derek was already in the bear's path. The grizzly slammed into him with full force, knocking him to the ground like a rag doll. He hit the snow hard. The wind knocked out of him as the bear's claws raked across his back. Blood stained the pristine snow as Derek let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing under the weight of the bear. The others sprang into action, their survival instincts taking over. Two skiers fumbled for their bear spray while another brandished his ski pole, hoping to distract the bear. The grizzly, however, was locked in a frenzy, its confusion amplifying its aggression. Its claws ripped into Derek's jacket, tearing through layers of fabric and flesh. The sound of the attack was a brutal symphony, growls, gasps, and the sickening thud of the bear's paws against human flesh. Liam advanced toward the bear, shaking his can of bear spray with trembling hands. In a desperate move, he discharged the spray, a cloud of irritant chemicals bursting into the air. The mist caught the wind and wafted towards the bear's face. The bear snarled in irritation, shaking its massive head as the spray took effect. For a moment, the beast hesitated, its eyes watering from the burning sensation. But Derek was in bad shape. His body lay crumpled in the snow, blood pooling beneath him. His breaths were shallow, the pain overwhelming him as his vision blurred. The bear, now more enraged than ever, turned to face the other skiers. One of them thrust his ski pole forward, jabbing it towards the bear's snout. The bear batted it away with ease, nearly snapping the pole in two with the force of its paw. Realizing the bear was still too close, the group continued their assault. More bear spray was unleashed, and the skiers waved their poles frantically, trying to keep the bear at bay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the grizzly recoiled, shaking its head violently as the burning chemicals overwhelmed its senses. With a final guttural growl, the bear retreated, disappearing back into the trees from where it had come. The mountain was silent, broken only by the labored breathing of the group and Derek's soft whimpers. The once pristine snow was now stained with his blood, painting a grim picture. Time was critical. Though the bear had vanished, they knew it could return at any moment. Liam knelt beside Derek, assessing his injuries. Deep gashes crisscrossed his back and arms, his jacket torn to shreds. Blood seeped into the snow. He was alive, but barely, each breath a struggle. With no quick rescue possible in this remote area, they fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their skis, securing Derek as best they could. The group began their slow descent through deep snowdrifts and treacherous slopes, each step a reminder of the lurking danger. Every gust of wind sent their hearts racing, and they feared the bear might return. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped low, they finally reached an area with enough signal to call for help. Derek's condition had worsened. His breathing grew shallow and his skin turned pale. Huddled together, exhausted and shaken, they awaited rescue. The wilderness had transformed from a playground into a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving reality. The Jacobs family, living as homesteaders in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, knew very well that nature is unpredictable. They had dealt with many hardships, but each time they managed to bounce right back. Adaptability was key out there, as well as strong family ties. Pat Jacobs, a rugged 45-year-old with a thick beard and calloused hands from hard work, had moved his family to this remote land 20 years ago when his oldest son, Will, was only 2 years old. Marge, his devoted 42-year-old wife, had embraced the challenge with unwavering determination and had since managed to make a real home, using little less than what Alaska provided them. Their son, Will, now 22, was a skilled hunter and trapper, while their 16-year-old daughter, Jo, had a natural affinity for animals and tended to their livestock with care. They were a happy, hard-working family. Their lives revolved around the homestead and the land. They felt a deep connection to the land. They rose with the sun, always mindful to treat their stock with respect and care. Pat, the head of the family, would often head out early to hunt or chop firewood. Will spent his days setting traps for small games and checking the perimeter of their homestead. They knew they could never be too careful out there. Marge and Joe would gather wild berries, preserve food for the long winter months, and tend to the chickens, goats, and cows that provided them with eggs, milk, and meat. The family didn't feel isolated. If anything, they were always busy, and they always felt the satisfaction of living off the land. That's not to say they wanted a company. They knew other people, people who lived like them, but the homesteads were far away. It was the autumn of 2019. The days were grayer and shorter, and it was getting colder. One evening, after a long day of preparing for the approaching winter, the family gathered inside their home, a cozy log cabin. They had a fire going on, casting a warm glow. It was time to eat. The scent of Marge's stew was enough to make a stomach or two growls in anticipation. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness. The moon was full. It cast long shadows over the homestead. The livestock was alert. The animals felt something the Jacobs family couldn't. Unbeknownst to the Jacobs family, a grizzly bear had caught the scent of their livestock. Driven by hunger, the bear crept closer, its powerful body moving silently through the night. After the family finished eating, they decided to relax in the living room for a little while before heading to bed. It was then that Joe, the family's 16-year-old, first began to suspect something was wrong. Joe was used to being attuned to the livestock. She knew and loved these animals. When she heard the distant, unsettling noise of the animals stirring in their pens, she felt herself panicking. She turned to Pat and told him she believed that the animals seemed restless. Her voice was tinged with worry. Pat, ever vigilant and not one to distrust his family, grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. Joe followed suit, too worried to stay put. As he scanned the darkness, the beam of light caught the reflection of the bear's eyes. The massive grizzly stood at the edge of the clearing, just a few feet away from Pat and Joe. Its breath was visible in the cold night air. Pat's heart raced. He had dealt with bears before, but this one was different. For one thing, it was larger. And Pat didn't like the look in its eyes, as if the animal were out for blood. Pat yelled at Joe, telling her to get back inside, his voice urgent. Joe turned to run, but the bear charged with terrifying speed. It reached Joe before she could react, its powerful paw swiping her to the ground. Her scream pierced the night, a sound that sent chills down Pat's spine. Alerted by the commotion, Marge and Will rushed outside. They watched in horror as the bear attacked Joe. Pat ran towards the barn, desperately trying to reach his shotgun. The bear, its focus now shifting, turned and barreled towards him. Pat's hand was on the door when the bear slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. He struggled to get up, but the bear was on him in an instant, its jaws clamping down on his neck. With a sickening crunch, the bear killed Pat. Marge screamed. She couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Only moments ago, her husband and their daughter were alive and well, and now there they were, gone forever. Crazed with grief, Marge lunged forward, grabbing a pitchfork from the barn and thrusting it at the bear. Will, with tears streaming down his face, shouted at his mother to get inside and call for help. He grabbed a nearby axe, swinging it at the bear, trying to draw its attention away from his mother. The bear turned towards Will, who was equally terrified and determined to live. Marge almost couldn't believe it as her feet carried her inside the cabin, her hands shaking as she grabbed the radio to alert emergency rescuers. She called for help, her voice breaking. She could utter one word, only help. Will faced the bear with grim determination. He swung the axe again, but the bear knocked it from his hands with a powerful swipe. It lunged at him, its claws tearing through his clothes and flesh. Will fought with all his might, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. With a final desperate gasp, Will fell, his body crumpling to the ground. Marge, hearing her son's cries cut short, dropped the radio and grabbed a kitchen knife. She stepped outside, her heart pounding, to find the bear standing over Will's lifeless body. Her whole family was gone. She knew she couldn't survive. She didn't want to survive. Marge lunged forward with the knife raised. The bear met Marge head-on. The woman slashed at it more out of instinct than out of conviction. The bear's thick fur and sheer power rendered her efforts futile. The bear swiped at her, the impact sending her sprawling. As she tried to crawl away, the bear's jaws closed around her leg, dragging her back. Marge stopped fighting and accepted her fate. but she couldn't control her screams, which echoed through the forest until they were abruptly silenced. The once peaceful homestead was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Pat, Marge, Will, and Joe lay scattered, their blood staining the ground. The Grizzly lost interest in the bodies. The animal attacked the livestock and sated its hunger. Hours later, rescue teams arrived, alerted by Marge's frantic radio call. They found the bear gorging itself on the livestock. It was a gruesome, eerily silent scene, despite the bear's growls and the murmurs of the remaining livestock. The bear tried to attack the rescuers, and it was killed in the process. The sight that greeted them was one of devastation and loss, a tragic reminder of the constant danger faced by those living on the edge of the wild. The Jacobs family's story became a somber tale of courage and tragedy, showing the harsh realities of life in the Alaskan wilderness. Their deaths shook their local community. Elena Volkov was a photographer who lived for the thrill of the wild, and Kamchatka's rugged wilderness offered exactly the challenge she craved. She had traveled across the globe, capturing the intimate moments of nature's fiercest animals, from the Serengeti's lions to the Arctic's polar bears. Yet it was Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula that had drawn her in with its raw beauty and its elusive brown bears, particularly the protective mothers and their cubs. She sought an image that captured not just a bear, but the emotion of its existence, the bond between mother and cub. The remote peninsula had an almost otherworldly quality, with its dense forests, rushing rivers, and looming volcanoes. Few ventured this far from civilization, and even fewer had the expertise to get close to the brown bears that roamed these lands. Elena had brought along an experienced local guide, Sergei, a grizzled man who knew these bears like few others. He was cautious, perhaps overly so in Elena's eyes. The bears, after all, were creatures of habit, predictable in their rhythms as long as one respected their space. They had spent days tracking a female brown bear and her two cubs, following from a safe distance as she fished along a riverbank and led her cubs through the wilderness. Elena had taken hundreds of photos, each one closer to the perfection she sought, but still missing that elusive spark. The bears moved through a low valley surrounded by thick forest, and from a ridge above, Elena caught a glimpse of something special. The mother bear had paused in a clearing, her cubs playfully wrestling beside her. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting the scene in a golden glow. It was perfect, but it wasn't close enough. Sergei warned her to stay back. He had seen this before. Photographers, eager for the perfect shot, forgetting the genuine danger that lay between them and their subjects. Elena, however, felt the moment calling to her. She reassured herself that she knew the limits and that her years of experience would guide her. Carefully, she descended from the ridge, edging through the thick brush that led down into the valley. The terrain was uneven, and the foliage made it difficult to see clearly. But she pressed on, her camera ready in hand. Her breath quickened as she closed the gap. She knew she was closer than Sergei would ever allow, but the shot was worth it. The mother bear had lifted her head, sniffing the air, her eyes scanning the horizon. Elena crouched low, trying to appear as small and non-threatening as possible. She aimed her camera, framing the perfect shot of the mother's watchful gaze juxtaposed with the innocence of her cubs. Suddenly, the mother bear's posture shifted. Her head turned sharply in Elena's direction, her body tensing as she perceived an intruder too close for comfort. Elena froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized just how much danger she had put herself in. The bear's eyes locked onto her, and in that instant, there was no mistaking the animal's intentions. Elena had crossed a line. The charge came swiftly. There was no growl, no warning, just the sudden explosive motion of the bear lunging toward her. Elena's instincts screamed at her to retreat, but the ground beneath her was treacherous. Her boots slipped on the damp moss and she stumbled, her legs failing to find traction on the uneven terrain. The camera, which had been her lifeline moments ago, now felt like a dead weight in her hands. She tried to scramble backward, her limbs heavy with panic. The world around her seemed to blur as the mother bear closed the distance with terrifying speed. Elena's legs gave way beneath her and she collapsed to the ground, a sharp rock jutting into her back as she landed. She felt a surge of pain shoot through her, but it was nothing compared to the terror of seeing the bear's massive form looming above her. In the fraction of a second before the attack, Elena locked eyes with the bear. The mother was no longer just an animal. She was a force of nature, a protector, and Elena had made the fatal mistake of becoming a perceived threat. The bear's paw, powerful and heavy, swung down with a force that Elena could hardly comprehend. She tried to shield herself, raising her arms in a futile gesture, but the impact was brutal. The bear's claws ripped through her jacket, slicing into her skin with ease. Elena felt the sharp, burning pain spread across her body as the swipe connected. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to breathe. The weight of the animal pressed down on her, as if the very earth had risen to crush her. Her thoughts were disjointed and scattered as her mind fought against the overwhelming pain and fear. Through the haze of agony, she could hear Sergei's voice in the distance, shouting, though the words were lost in the chaos. She barely registered the sound of the bear's low growl. A warning meant not for her, but for the unseen threat she had become in the bear's eyes. Sergei was close now, but Elena's body was shutting down, her strength ebbing away as blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the forest floor. The bear, perhaps sensing Sergei's approach or simply deciding she had done enough, relented. With a final snort, she turned and lumbered back toward her cubs, her protective instincts still in overdrive. Elena lay motionless on the ground, the remnants of her camera shattered beside her, blood staining the lenses. Sergei rushed to her side, breathless and pale with fear. The first aid kit he carried seemed woefully inadequate against the wounds she had suffered. He managed to drive the bear away using flares and shouts to ensure the mother wouldn't return, but the damage had been done. Elena was barely conscious, her breath shallow and ragged. The remote wilderness that had once been her playground had now become her prison. Sergei knew that help was hours, maybe even a day away, and with each passing moment, Elena's chance of survival slipped further. Sarah Chen was no stranger to the rugged trails of the Alaska wilderness. An experienced trail runner, she had spent countless hours exploring the pristine wilderness, reveling in the solitude that only the untamed beauty of nature could offer. Today was no different. The morning light was breaking through the thick canopy of trees as she ran along the dirt path, her breathing steady and her mind focused. As she rounded a bend in the trail, the air suddenly felt different. A heaviness settled around her, and the usual rustling of small creatures and birds seemed to pause. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as a deep instinctual fear took root. She slowed her pace, her senses now on high alert, and then she saw it. Just ahead, in the tall grass by the trail, was a grizzly bear with 2 cubs. The massive mother was grazing while her cubs played nearby, their tiny frames a stark contrast to the bulk of their protective parent. Sarah froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears as adrenaline surged through her body. She knew the gravity of the situation. She had inadvertently placed herself between the mother and her cubs. Her mind raced through the bear safety protocols she had memorized. She slowly began to back away, careful not to make any sudden movements that could provoke the bear. But the mother bear had already spotted her. The bear's head snapped up, nostrils flaring as it caught Sarah's scent. The cubs were still oblivious to the presence of the intruder, but the mother's demeanor changed instantly. The calm graze turned into a focused, defensive posture. In one terrifying instant, the bear charged. There was no time to think, only to react. Sarah's instincts screamed for her to run, but she knew better. Running from a grizzly was futile. It could easily outrun her. Instead, she dropped to the ground and curled into a tight ball, her hands clasped behind her neck, knees tucked to her chest and head down. It was the only chance she had, the final card she could play in a desperate situation. The sound of the bear's paws thudding against the earth grew louder, and in seconds the bear was upon her. Sarah felt the earth tremble beneath the weight of the grizzly as it stopped mere inches from her. She forced herself to remain as still as possible, hoping, praying that the bear would lose interest, but that hope was shattered when the first heavy blow landed. The bear's paw swiped at her with terrifying force, sending a jolt of pain through her side. The sheer power behind the strike was overwhelming. It felt as though her ribs might crack from the impact. Then came the bite. The bear's teeth clamped down on her thigh, its jaws like a vice cutting through her running tights and skin with horrifying ease. The pain was blinding, white-hot, and all-consuming. She could feel the warmth of her blood soaking into the earth beneath her, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The only way to survive was to continue playing dead, no matter how much every fiber of her being screamed to fight or flee. The bear's assault was brutal but brief. After a few more moments of mauling, the mother grizzly seemed to decide that Sarah was no longer a threat. The bear released its grip on her and, with a huff, backed away. Sarah heard the bear's heavy breathing and felt the vibrations of its massive body as it lingered for a moment longer. Then, mercifully, the bear moved off, her cubs following obediently behind her. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah didn't move. She listened to the sounds of the forest, the fading rustle of the bear family as they disappeared into the brush. Her body trembled both from the pain and the shock. She had survived the initial attack, but her ordeal was far from over. Every breath she took sent sharp stabs of pain through her torso, and her leg throbbed with the deep puncture wounds from the bear's bite. She gingerly moved her hands to inspect the damage, wincing as her fingers grazed the torn flesh. Blood soaked her leg and pooled beneath her on the trail. She needed to stop the bleeding, but she had no supplies, no bandages, only her clothing. She ripped a section of her shirt and tied it tightly around her leg, improvising a makeshift tourniquet. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Then came the grim realization. She was still miles from the trailhead. Alone, injured, and leaving a trail of blood, she was far from safety. The thought of moving was agonizing, but staying put wasn't an option. The bear was still in the area, and the scent of her blood could attract more predators. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sarah forced herself to stand. The pain in her leg was excruciating, and every step sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. But she pushed forward, determined to survive. She hobbled along the trail, using the trees for support, each movement slow and deliberate. Her body screamed in protest, but her mind was focused on one goal: getting out alive. The hours dragged on as she painstakingly made her way down the trail, her vision swimming and her strength waning. She knew the blood loss was significant, and every step felt heavier than the last. The forest, once a place of solace and beauty, now felt like a hostile maze, each rustle of leaves a reminder that danger was never far away. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, Sarah pressed on. Her body was broken, her spirit battered, but she refused to give in. The bear had moved on, but she was still fighting for her life. Each agonizing step was a testament to her will to survive. Finally, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, she spotted the faint outline of the trailhead in the distance. Her body sagged with relief, but the struggle was not over. She still had to make it those last few 100 yards, through the pain and the blood loss, before she could even hope for help. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah pushed forward, her mind clinging to the thought of survival. The bear had spared her life once, but now it was up to her to utilize the opportunity. Young and incredibly in love, Jesse and Connor Martin had always treasured their shared spirit of adventure. They were brought together from the beginning by their common love of the outdoors. Jesse was 28 years old, while Connor was older by 2 years. On August 27, 2017, the couple were on one of their adventures. This time, their need for excitement brought them to the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. The park drew them in because of its amazing scenery, wide variety of fauna, and unspoiled beauty. The park provided a perfect haven from their hectic life, allowing them to hike challenging paths, take in the beauty of the natural world, and see the stars in the clear mountain skies. Rocky Mountain National Park, with its towering peaks, alpine lakes, and dense forests, was a perfect spot for outdoor enthusiasts. However, visitors were always advised to follow strict safety guidelines to protect both themselves and the wildlife. Jesse and Connor were thorough in their preparations, ensuring they stored their food properly and kept a clean campsite to avoid attracting animals. Their weekend began as planned. They were giddy with anticipation and couldn't contain their excitement. They hiked scenic trails, marveled at the stunning vistas, and captured countless photos of their adventures, perfect to share on their joint Facebook account. As sunset approached on their second day, they set up camp in a more isolated area, eager to enjoy a peaceful evening under the stars. Jesse and Connor were deeply in love, and as such, they wanted their vacation to be a romantic one. They wanted to focus only on each other and the stars. But fate had other plans for the young couple. Unbeknownst to them, a black bear was lurking nearby. The bear had had a rough couple of weeks. It was in pain, suffering from a deep wound inflicted by a poacher's trap. The pain made the animal hostile, more aggressive than usual, and prone to violence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jesse and Connor got the campfire going. Then they sat next to it, hugging and talking about their future, their voices a gentle murmur against the backdrop of the crackling fire. They talked about having kids, something they had put off in order to focus on their respective careers, but they both felt that now was the right time. The scent of their dinner, a simple meal cooked over the flames, lingered in the air, pleasant and cozy. Without warning, the bear emerged from the darkness, its eyes glinting with a mix of pain and fury. Jessie screamed, her eyes widening in terror as she noticed the bear. She tried to warn Connor, but it was too late. The bear charged, covering the distance to the campsite in a flash. Connor sprang to his feet, instinctively placing himself between Jessie and the bear. He had to save his wife. He barely had enough time to tell her to get back to the car, and then the bear was upon him. Jessie hesitated for a moment before scrambling towards their vehicle. She knew her best chance to save Connor was to get some kind of weapon. The bear lunged at Connor, its claws slashing through his shirt and tearing into his flesh. He cried out in pain, but he refused to back down. Desperation fueled his efforts to protect his wife. He grabbed a branch from the ground, wielding it like a club, but he was no equal to the bear. With a powerful swipe, the bear knocked Connor to the ground, his body crumpling on impact. Jessie, hearing her husband's agonized cries, turned back in horror. She saw the bear standing over Connor, its jaws closing around his neck in a brutal final act. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed his name, her heart breaking as she watched the life drain from his eyes. Desperate to save her husband, Jessie grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear. The bear left Connor and turned its attention to her. Jessie backed away slowly, but the bear, driven by rage and pain, charged again. She tripped over a log and fell to the ground, her hand scrabbling for something to defend herself with. She found a small, sharp rock on the ground and held it out in front of her, her hands trembling. The bear was on her in an instant, swatting the rock away as if it were nothing. Jessie felt a searing pain as its claws raked across her body. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, trying to hit the animal on the snout or gouge its eyes out, but the bear's power was too much. It pinned her to the ground, its jaws closing around her throat. Her screams were cut short as the world faded to darkness, the last thing she saw being the cold, merciless eyes of the bear. The fire still crackled, but there was nobody to admire it. The bear lingered there for a short while before disappearing into the forest, its thirst for violence now quenched. The bodies of Jessie and Connor lay motionless, their dreams of a future together brutally extinguished. Rescue teams arrived hours later, alerted by another group of campers who had heard the distant screams. The sight that greeted them was devastating. They identified the bodies and then had the painful task of letting their families know. How could that happen? And where was the bear that caused the disaster? Park rangers traced the bear and decided the animal was a potential threat to all humans. In the end, the animal was euthanized, and its suffering is now gone. The tragic story of Jessie and Connor Martin spread quickly, a somber tale that underscored the harsh realities of nature. They had followed all the rules and taken every precaution, yet they were no match for the ferocity of an injured bear. The Wilson family's annual camping trip to a park in Montana had always been a cherished tradition. The beauty of the untamed wilderness, the crackling campfires, and the quiet serenity of nature under the stars brought peace and a sense of connection to John and Mary Wilson and their two young children, Emily and Jacob. This year, they had chosen a particularly remote campsite, nestled deep in the park, hoping to escape the crowds and reconnect with the wild landscapes they loved. That evening, the campsite was lively with laughter as the family roasted marshmallows over the fire, exchanging stories of past trips. As the evening deepened and the fire dimmed, the children grew drowsy and climbed into their sleeping bags while John carefully doused the remaining embers of the fire. The night was still and silent as the Wilsons retreated into their tent. The soft rustle of the forest was all they could hear as they slipped into sleep. Unbeknownst to them, an ominous presence lingered in the forest nearby. A black bear, conditioned by previous campers who had carelessly left food out, had grown bold and unafraid of humans. This particular bear had learned that campsites often meant easy meals, and it was now emboldened, drawn by the faint scent of food from the Wilson site. The bear moved with eerie quietness, its dark form blending into the pitch black of the forest night, snuffling the air for any trace of sustenance. It had approached other campsites earlier that week, stealing unattended food with no natural consequence. Tonight, the scent of food wafted from the Wilsons' site. Though they had stored most of their food correctly, a few overlooked scraps were enough to pique the bear's interest. Slowly it advanced, eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. The scent led the bear directly to the family's tent. Inside the tent, all was peaceful. Mary stirred slightly in her sleep, unaware of the approaching danger. The children lay soundly in their sleeping bags between their parents, insulated by the tent's thin fabric. It wasn't until the faintest sound of something brushing against the outside of the tent reached John's ears that he stirred. He opened his eyes, heart thudding for no particular reason at first. Something was different. He lay still for a moment, straining to hear in the darkness. Then it came again, a soft, deliberate scratching sound like claws against the fabric. John's breath caught in his throat, the sound unfamiliar and out of place. Before he could react, a low grunt rumbled just beyond the tent flap. Suddenly, the tent's fabric ripped with a sharp, violent tear, and the bear's massive head pushed through the gap. John shot upright, grabbing at his wife's arm. Mary jolted awake, eyes wide in the darkness. The children stirred, disoriented and confused by the commotion. But there was no time to process the situation as the bear lunged further into the tent. In the chaos, John scrambled to shield the children, his instincts screaming to protect them at all costs. He pushed them toward the farthest corner of the tent, but there was no real escape. The bear's powerful claws swiped at the fabric, shredding it further. Its breath was hot and rank, filling the space with a terrifying proximity. Mary's hands frantically fumbled for anything to use as a barrier, grabbing the nearest objects, blankets, sleeping bags, whatever might deter the animal. But the bear, driven by hunger and without fear, batted them aside with ease. Its massive body pressed into the tent, collapsing it further around them, the weight of the bear threatening to crush them. John reached for a flashlight, desperately shining it into the bear's eyes, hoping to disorient it. For a moment, the bright beam seemed to give the bear pause, but only for a heartbeat. It swatted the light out of his hand, sending it spinning into the darkness. The tent was now a chaotic flurry of thrashing limbs and guttural growls, the bear tearing at whatever it could reach, relentless in its search for food. Outside, the commotion had drawn the attention of nearby campers. Faint calls echoed through the night as people began to realize what was happening. Some grabbed flashlights and ran toward the Wilsons' campsite. Others yelled in panic, unsure of how to help. Inside the collapsing tent, Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She clung to Jacob, her youngest, shielding him with her body, while John did his best to fend off the bear with nothing more than his bare hands and a camping chair he had managed to grab. The bear growled in frustration, its claws raking through the fabric, inches away from John's arm. The nearby campers arrived, flashlights swinging wildly in the dark, illuminating the terrifying scene. Some carried pots and pans, banging them loudly to scare the bear off, but it only seemed to enrage the animal further. A man wielding a large stick approached cautiously, but the bear turned on him with a ferocious snarl, causing him to backpedal quickly. In the chaos, someone threw a rock at the bear, striking it on the side. The animal growled deeply, hesitating for a brief moment as the barrage of noise and movement confused it. But its hunger overpowered its fear, and it returned to its task, clawing and biting at the remnants of the tent, determined to get inside. John, now bleeding from a shallow gash on his arm, fought to keep the bear at bay, but his strength was waning. The tent was all but destroyed, and the bear was closing in on his family. In a last desperate attempt, he grabbed a can of bear spray from his pack, fumbled with the cap, and unleashed it directly into the bear's face. The bear roared in surprise, rearing back as the spray hit its eyes and nose, burning with intensity. Disoriented by the attack, it shook its massive head and retreated several steps. The campers, seeing the bear's reaction, intensified their efforts, making more noise, waving their flashlights wildly and throwing whatever they could find. Finally, the bear backed away, still growling but now blinded and confused by the bear spray. It retreated into the woods, its massive form disappearing into the darkness from which it had come. The Wilsons, battered and shaken, emerged from the wreckage of their tent, clinging to one another in disbelief. The other campers rushed to their aid, their faces pale in the moonlight, some trembling with adrenaline. John and Mary, their hearts still racing, could barely comprehend what had just happened. They had survived the attack, but the memory of the bear's furious claws and the close call to death would haunt them for years to come. The Thompson family, consisting of David, Angela, and their teenage daughter Amy, had always loved their yearly summer vacation to Glacier National Park in Montana. This year, on June 12th, 2024, marked their 5th visit to this remote paradise. They all deeply appreciated the peace and quiet that nature offers. Angela, a nurse, valued the respite from her taxing profession, while David, a high school history teacher, found serenity in the mountains. Even with her teenage angst, Amy enjoyed the freedom and adventure these trips provided. Glacier National Park was a refuge for people looking to get away from the stress of everyday life, with its untamed woods, rocky mountains, and valleys sculpted by glaciers. The Thompsons' cabin was situated miles away from the closest town, deep in this remote wilderness. With its wraparound porch and rustic wooden construction, the cabin was perfect for those who wanted to relish the breathtaking views of the surroundings. It was the kind of place that always offered warmth. Simply put, the cabin was inviting with its large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and walls, which were decorated with pictures and maps from their past travels. The family usually spent their summer vacation hiking, fishing, reading on the porch, or simply relaxing. David, being a history teacher, loved to tell Angela and Amy stories about the park's past and the Native American tribes that used to live there. Amy saw the family's annual summer vacation as an opportunity to practice her drawing skills. She would often spend long hours sketching the breathtaking views. At the same time, her mother, Angela, took pictures of the various flowers and animals they encountered. The vacation was a success, or so they believed, but it all changed on the 3rd evening of their vacation. That evening, the Thompsons decided dinner on the porch would be nice. They wanted to enjoy the cool breeze and the sounds of the forest as darkness embraced the park. The sun was still out but setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape. David had had a lot of luck fishing that afternoon. As such, they had plenty of fish for dinner. David and Angela grilled the fish together while Amy prepared the vegetables. They were all in a good mood, laughing and joking around. They were also dreading the end of their vacation, but their spirits were high for the most part. They even decided to come to the cabin again for their winter vacation and invite some friends too. About an hour they were just finishing their meal when Amy noticed something moving in the shadows of the nearby trees. She was the only one facing the forest. She quickly darted her eyes to her father and told David to look towards the forest. The man squinted, trying to figure out what it was that he was seeing. But it didn't take long for the Thompsons to make out the shape. Suddenly, a massive grizzly bear, wild with hunger, emerged from the trees. Its beady eyes were fixed on the family. It was a chilling sight. For a second, Amy thought that was the stare of an ancient beast. The teenager wasn't too far from the truth. Driven into human territory by the scarcity of natural food sources, the bear was dangerously hungry and aggressive. Angela was just about to tell her family to run inside the cabin, but the bear was faster. The animal charged, covering the distance to the porch and the terrified family in mere seconds. David acted out of instinct, grabbing a nearby chair to use as a makeshift weapon. He knew their best shot, and it was a slim shot anyway, was to fight and hope to fool the bear into thinking the fight wasn't worth it. In the meantime, he told Angela to get Amy inside, his voice trembling with fear. Angela pulled Amy towards the cabin door, but they moved too slowly. The bear was simply too fast. With a powerful swipe of its massive paw, the bear knocked David to the ground. David quickly regained his strength and resolve. He swung the chair with all his might, but it was no use against the bear's terrifying strength. Angela screamed in terror as she looked around herself, searching for something to fend off the beast. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the table and swung it at the bear, hitting it on the head. The bear roared in pain and stumbled for a moment, but was ultimately undeterred. The animal was in a frenzy, completely driven by hunger and rage. Amy was standing somewhat close to the cabin door, but she was frozen with fear, watching as the bear mauled her father. The sound of David's cries of pain pierced the evening air and shattered any last shred of hope Amy felt up until then. Desperate to save her husband, Angela continued to strike the bear, but it was like trying to stop a freight train with a feather. The bear turned its attention to Angela, swatting her away with terrifying force. She hit the ground hard, the skillet slipping from her grasp. Angela heard a nauseating sound. the sound of her skull cracking upon impact. Bloodied and bruised, she tried to crawl towards Amy, who was sobbing uncontrollably. She pleaded with her daughter to run, her voice merely a whisper. Amy, her heart pounding, turned and fled into the cabin, slamming the door behind her. She could hear the sounds of the struggle outside, her parents' cries mingling with the bear's roars. She searched for something, anything to defend herself. Grabbing a hunting knife from the kitchen, she stood by the door, trembling and praying for a miracle. Outside, the fight was over. David and Angela's lifeless bodies lay on the blood-stained porch. They were gone. But the bear's bloodthirst was far from sated. It began to sniff around the cabin, drawn by the scent of Amy inside. Amy instinctively knew her parents were dead, and she feared she was next. She backed away from the door, holding the knife in front of her. If only she could reach the phone in time, and maybe then she could barricade herself in one of the rooms. As her mind raced, Amy didn't realize a crucial mistake she had made. She had forgotten to lock the door behind her. In an instant, the door swung open and the bear charged inside the cabin. Amy screamed, slashing at the bear with the knife, but all her attempts were futile. The blade barely penetrated the bear's thick, matted fur. The bear's jaws closed around Amy's neck, silencing her cries. In an instant, she was dead. The whole attack lasted 3 minutes. The Thompsons never stood a chance. 2 days later, Jim, a family friend who had a cabin of his own in the park, decided to pay them a quick visit. He was concerned by their uncharacteristic silence. The sight that greeted him was one of unimaginable horror. The once cozy cabin was now a scene of carnage. The porch and interior stained with blood. The bodies of David, Angela, and Amy lay where they had fallen. The devastating loss of the Thompson family stunned everyone in their community. Friends and family were inconsolable, finding it difficult to accept the senseless and terrible death. The event brought up important issues about the management of animals and the growing threat posed by hungry predators. The tragic tale of the Thompson family's last moments served as a sobering reminder of the fragile balance that exists between humans and nature, a balance that can be upset and, as such, result in unimaginable disaster. Crisp Alaskan air enveloped Mike and Dave as they waded into the salmon stream, their annual fly fishing trip in full swing. Best friends for years, they sought peace in this remote wilderness, far from the noise of daily life. Working in harmony, they cast their lines and watched the salmon flash beneath the surface. Mike stood a few yards upstream, focused on the rhythm of his rod and the rush of water around his waders. Meanwhile, Dave scanned the bank, admiring the wild beauty of their surroundings. The soothing sound of rushing water and the occasional splash of fish created a serene atmosphere. Suddenly, that tranquility shattered. A brown bear emerged from the tree line, blending into the shadows until it was mere feet from the stream. Startled, Mike locked eyes with the massive predator. Fear surged through him as the bear let out a low growl, a sound that silenced the wilderness. Before Mike could react, the bear lunged, its enormous paws cutting through the water. He stumbled backward, his fishing rod tumbling into the stream, but it was too late. The bear's claws hooked into Mike's jacket, dragging him into the freezing water. Shock set in as the icy current hit him like a wall. The bear's weight bore down on him, water churning violently around them. Desperately, Mike kicked to free himself, but the bear's grip was too firm. His vision blurred, and cold water filled his mouth as he struggled to stay afloat. Dave stood frozen, heart racing as he watched his best friend disappear beneath the thrashing bear. His fly rod felt useless against the creature. Instinct screamed for him to flee, but a deeper resolve compelled him to stay and help Mike. He couldn't abandon his friend in the jaws of danger. The bear, now fully submerged in the stream with Mike trapped beneath its bulk, seemed momentarily distracted by the tumult of water and thrashing limbs. Dave sprinted along the bank, his boots splashing through the shallow edges of the stream as he frantically searched for anything he could use as a weapon. The trees were too far to reach without losing sight of Mike, and there was nothing but rocks and water around him. Mike's struggles grew weaker as the freezing water sapped the strength from his limbs. Every time he surfaced, the bear's powerful jaws or claws forced him back down. His chest burned with the effort of trying to breathe, and his vision narrowed to a blur of brown fur, rushing water, and the cold, clear blue sky above. The cold had turned his movement sluggish, his body no longer responding to the frantic commands from his mind. Dave spotted a thick branch lodged in the rocky bank and snatched it up. It was heavy but sturdy, better than nothing. Without hesitation, he ran downstream to where the bear had dragged Mike, now wrestling in the deeper part of the current. The icy water lapped at Dave's legs as he waded in, brandishing the branch like a spear. His breath came in ragged gasps, more from fear than exertion. The bear, still focused on Mike, didn't see Dave approaching from the side. With every ounce of strength he had, Dave swung the branch toward the bear's head, the force of the blow jarring his arms. The bear roared in pain and surprise, jerking its massive body toward Dave, releasing its grip on Mike for a split second. The water exploded around them as the animal reared back, its enormous body casting a shadow over Dave. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Dave felt the bear's eyes on him, its dark gaze filled with primal rage. He knew he couldn't outrun it. The weight of the branch suddenly felt insignificant against the sheer power of the bear, but there was no time to think, only to act. He swung again, aiming for the bear's muzzle this time. The branch cracked against bone, sending the bear into a frenzy. It roared and lunged toward Dave, but the water slowed its movements, the current working in his favor. Mike, weakened and gasping for air, floated downstream, limp and pale against the dark water. Dave's mind raced as he backed away, trying to keep the bear's attention on him while inching toward the bank. His muscles screamed in protest, the cold water numbing his legs. He had to keep moving, had to find a way to keep the bear away from Mike, who was now drifting dangerously close to the rapids downstream. Suddenly the bear turned, its massive body crashing through the water toward Mike, who was helplessly floating toward the rocks. Dave's heart seized. He sprinted along the bank, barely keeping pace with the bear as it pursued Mike downstream. The current grew stronger, pulling Mike faster. The bear, still enraged, struggled to keep up, its focus split between Dave and the helpless man. With a burst of desperation, Dave spotted a large rock near the bank. He hoisted it above his head and hurled it at the bear's flank. The rock struck true, sending the bear crashing aside. That moment of distraction was enough. Mike, barely conscious, slipped out of reach as the current dragged him further toward calmer waters. Dazed, the bear finally gave up the chase, retreating into the forest. Dave watched in a mix of horror and relief as it disappeared, leaving him panting on the bank. Without hesitation, Dave plunged into the icy stream, rushing to where Mike lay motionless in a shallow pool. It was clear he had succumbed to hypothermia. Dave quickly lifted him from the water, pressing against his chest to expel excess water before slinging him over his shoulder. Navigating the slippery banks, each step was a battle against the cold. After what felt like hours, the outline of a cabin appeared. Summoning his strength, Dave called for help. A couple of hikers rushed to assist, laying Mike by the fireplace and wrapping him in blankets. As the warmth returned, Mike's eyes fluttered open, and they exchanged a glance, two friends forever bonded by their ordeal.